Everybody's got a story. You just have to listen. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and this is Good Listen. And today, we're going to be talking about history and civics. No. Please, don't stop this video or podcast. Just give me a second. Bear with me. Today, I've got Sharon McMahon, who is a beacon of civic education in this era of historical and political uncertainty. You've all heard about fake news and alternative facts. Well, we're going to cut through that today. And we're going to talk about her journey and how she's become known as America's government teacher. Sharon McMahon, welcome to Good Listen. How are you?
So good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. And I want to kind of begin the conversation with some scary stats, because there's nothing better than a good scary stat, Sharon. I'm sure you love stats as well as anybody. So in 2022, only 14% of 8th graders nationwide scored proficient in U.S. history, and only 22% reached that benchmark in civics. How do we get here, Sharon? You are known as America's government teacher. Why have we fallen so fast in this world of social studies, history, civics? What went wrong?
Well, there's a few things. How much time do you have? It's a couple items that have been compounding over the years. The first thing has to do with, our funding of civics education. The statistics are truly staggering how little money we spend on civics education. It's like 5 cents per student per year. And when you compare that to how much we spend funding other, like STEM activities, it absolutely pales in comparison. That's not to say that science and math and all these things are not important. They are important. But one of the reasons for that is because we began to see this trend where the United States was falling behind its international peers in education, especially when it comes to these objective tests in science and math, right? Like when you are comparing the United States to Finland or China or whatever, U.S. history isn't one of the subjects that's being measured on these tests. And so consequently, it becomes very easy for policymakers who are often not educators. It becomes very easy for them to say, well, then we should throw all of the spaghetti at increasing proficiency in STEM subjects. And that seems like a good idea. I understand where it comes from. You don't want the rest of the world to outpace United States students. Like, we need to be producing the best and brightest people. I understand the mentality. But in reality, there's a much bigger issue at play that the United States, by and large, is unwilling to address when it comes to our educational objectives. And that issue is childhood poverty. There's one, two determining factors that make up whether or not your child will be successful in school. It is your income and your education level. And it does not matter nearly as much how beautiful the school building is. It does not matter nearly as much, how well funded the school is, although the schools should be funded and the teachers paid well. But those are the two biggest determining factors. And when you look at other countries where their students are performing extremely well, countries like Finland, they don't have childhood poverty. That is just simply not a thing there because they have decided that their resources are going to be spent on in a different way than we do in the United States. So even if you have the best teacher in the world with like the most degrees and the best pedagogy and the most warm, friendly manner and the best curriculum and the most beautiful buildings, even if you have all of that, none of that can even hope to bridge the gap of childhood poverty, of the parental education and income level, that birth to age 5 is so important. The number of books your children are read throughout their childhood is so important. And if you are, as a parent, are working 3 jobs to try to put food in your children's mouths, you don't have the opportunity to read them, 1,000 books before age 3 or whatever the new, sort of initiative is.
Right.
So that's one. Those are a couple of the ways that we got there. A shift in STEM education, which I do agree is important, but a lack of willingness to address childhood poverty.
Wow. Another thing, too, and this is probably a little more anecdotal, but when did history become an old man's hobby? Like, I feel like, especially I've noticed this more with Gen Z than millennials. So as a card-carrying Gen Xer, I can be judgmental of these younger generations now. But I feel like anything that happened before they were born didn't exist. Like the adage, oh, that happened before I was born. I'm like, well, the Beatles happened before I was born, but I know who the Beatles are. So I don't know if it's a generational thing. So this is where I get into the anecdotal stuff. Like you see this on like when you see movies about World War II or movies about history. Oh, here's a dad show. Here's a dad
Yeah.
movie. And it's like, wait, but I mean, I get that that's a genre that older, maybe white men love, but when did it become that history was just for old white people as opposed to everybody else?
Yeah, that's a really great observation and a great question. 70% of history books are written by men,
Okay.
and the overwhelming majority of them are written by white men. And we have sort of seen, seen that start to shift a little bit. But even just going through, like the top selling history books in the last 20 years, only a tiny handful are written by women. And they're probably written by women. Maybe you've heard of like the Doris Kearns
Right.
Goodwin type figures. But it's still because the genre is largely being written by white men for white men. Even the History Channel, which has a lot of cool programming on it, it's basically become like the channel of tanks. You know what I mean?
Right.
Airplane disasters. The very, very strong focus on some of even just like the channels that do this kind of TV programming. Very strong focus to their content appealing to older, like boomer white men. That's who is watching these things. So it's a great question of like, but why? Why is it the boomer men who are watching these shows and reading these books? And I think some of it has to do with the way we have traditionally written and watched history over the last century or so, where we have intentionally excluded women. We've intentionally excluded people who are traditionally marginalized. We don't, there has been no emphasis to sort of incorporate the stories of women, Black Americans, Asian Americans into the genre of United States history. Notice how we have a Black history section and then a U.S. history section. And that's not to say that there should not be historians who specialize in Black history. That's not to say that that's not a worthwhile genre. It absolutely is. But nevertheless, subconsciously, what does that tell us?
Two separate histories.
Separate histories. It's something separate from United States history. So I think that has something to do with it as well. That it is, there's a lot of programming and a lot of books about like tanks that is just not interesting to a huge swath of the population. But it is interesting to boomer men who buy the books and watch the shows.
All right, I will slightly push back on that because I feel like if you look back at history, it's always been written by white men. I mean,
Yeah,
religion's
you're not wrong. Totally.
created by white men. History, also,
Yeah.
so the reason I'm asking it in terms of the slight, and I'm pushing back because I agree with you, but the fact that why is it different now? Like, why now? Is it just because finally people are like, F that, that's not about me, that doesn't
Yeah.
affect my life? Is it more just people are more self-aware of we actually recognize it now as opposed to in the past we're like, John Smith wrote a book, this white dude from Massachusetts, like, oh, okay, cool. Now we're like, oh, wait a minute, why are only John Smiths writing these books? Is it
Yeah.
just because we're more self-aware?
Part of it, I think, is that we have now sort of become awakened to the fact that, like, listen, we've been intentionally excluding huge portions of the population. I don't want to now. I have the option. I don't want to read about tanks all day long. Like, that's not interesting to me. Also, the democratization of information has something to do with it, meaning it's much easier to obtain information that is outside of the dominant caste, the sort of dominant historic caste of like history's written by the victors, and the victors are white men with large amounts of military capital, political capital, and monetary capital. And that's who's writing the history. So now we have access to information that people of prior generations never had access to. And it's a little bit like, you know how they say the music of your adolescence is your music forever? You know, if you grew up listening to Nirvana, it's always going to slap. It just is. You know what I mean? Like, it's always going to be like, but I love grunge music. Or I love the Beatles, or whatever genre it is, whatever you were just like vibing to when you were 17, you're going to love it forever. And I think maybe there's a little element of that too. Like whatever you were learning about or whatever you were excited about when you were, a younger man is still what interests you. World War II, like there have been over 9,000 books written about World War II just in the United States. It continues to be a very, very interesting genre to this boomer generation whose dads were in the war, where you grew up idolizing your dad and hearing the stories about it. And you grew up, potentially hearing about reading it in the newspaper, etc. Your dads were in the war, and it's an interesting time. There's a clear victor. There's a clear bad guy. It appeals to the sense of good versus evil. Plus there were all kinds of tanks.
Yeah, a lot of tanks. Man,
so many tanks.
A lot of tanks, and it's so funny. And then me as again, admittedly Gen Xer, like I don't give a shit about that stuff. Like it takes a lot for me to get into like I'll read a good Eric Larson World War II book because I love the way it's written, the narrative style of it. Yeah. Like outside of that, man, all my friends have seen Band of Brothers. I'm like, I have no desire.
You don't want to see it
through 20 episodes of like the muck of like the worst parts of World War II. Like I appreciate it. I'm sure it's done really well. I just could never sit through it. So that like military and space were never two things that I never got into.
You don't relate.
A lot to drag me into that world. You mentioned democratization of news and information. So you take I always love to use the facts of life theme. You take the good, you take the bad, you then the facts of life. Well, the bad part of it is that everyone has a side of a story or alternative facts or fake news.
Totally.
Man, it's Sharon, us growing up, it was never like this. Like we could watch TV and get like the facts, and we all, and obviously we're educated and aware enough to know that maybe there was a little bit of a slant against, more liberal against conservative. I get it. But now I feel like the pendulum has swung so wildly that it's so sad. We're recording this in the middle of a hurricane where you're watching one news channel saying that nothing is being done to help these people. And then on another one, they're saying that everything's being done for these people. So no one knows where the truth lies. As someone who made it their life mission on educating people about the government and history and the stuff that makes this great, does it make you, like, let's use a kid word, is it cringy of the shit we're going through now in terms of like how news is diluted and broken down to fit and feed different parts of our population?
I think so. I mean, yeah, I think it is a little cringe. I think it's cringe that there are people out here thinking, the mental equivalent that the moon is made of green cheese. That's cringe, right? It's when I was growing up and when you were growing up, did you like Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, or
Brokaw?
Yeah, Tom Brokaw, exactly. And you watched CBS, ABC, or NBC based on which news broadcaster you liked the most, right? Because they basically all had the same information. It was just about like, my mom liked Peter Jennings the most. Who did your parents like the most?
Oh, we were Brokaw. We were an NBC family.
Okay, yeah. So for whatever reason, my mom that was her preference. But it wasn't because Peter Jennings was substantively different than the news you were getting from Tom Brokaw. They were telling the same stories by and large. Maybe their little human interest stories were a little different, but they're like overseas reporting and like bombing in Beirut. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But today you can actually choose what kind of information you want to be fed through a fire hose 24/7. Like, which fire hose would you like pointed at your face? The fire hose of information about how FEMA is literally just sitting in offices in New Jersey twiddling their thumbs? Or do you want the fire hose of information that has, here's everything FEMA has ever done since 1979? Do you know what I mean? Like you can actually pick which fire hose of information you want. Or if you don't choose, the algorithm will choose for you.
Right.
and it will see which one do you click on, which one do you spend the longest time watching, which one do you seem the most interested in, and then it will continue to be like, oh, he picked fire hose B, and then soon enough, it's trained to know what you're going to respond to. So yes, it can be very cringy, to use your word, that people are so media illiterate that they can fall for things that are obviously false because they do not know how to discern fact from fiction. They are more than willing to just fall for whatever because it fits their previously held existing narrative of how the world works. And our brains are actually they're hardwired to keep us safe from information that contradicts what we already believe. Because if you think about like the ancient hunter gatherers and you see a wolf on the horizon, you don't want your brain to be like, well, you know what? Sometimes wolves are misunderstood. And sometimes we should examine whether your internal bias against a wolf is fair or not. Like that was not evolutionarily useful information, right? Like your brain would actively try to protect you from that. And it would want you to react on your snap judgment because that's how we survived. And our human minds still have that exact same impulse. Now we can override it with our prefrontal cortexes, but but our base impulse is to gather that incoming information and to make a snap judgment on how we're going to react to it. If it does not align with our already existing beliefs that wolves are dangerous and we need to run away, then we will discard it immediately. And vice versa, right? We're still doing the same thing just when it comes to politics today. When I tell you, actually FEMA has spent $55 million over the last 2 weeks, or $55 billion over the last 2 weeks, aiding people in hurricane disaster relief. Either you immediately think to yourself, well, that's not true. You know what I mean? And then you scroll through your social media. Bob didn't get any FEMA money. And so consequently, FEMA has spent no money. Or your immediate response is like, yeah, it sucks that the hurricanes are happening. And it sucks that climate change is such blah, blah, blah. Like you either immediately discard what I just told you because it does not fit with your currently held belief system, or you are willing to adopt it because it does fit with it. And that is how your human mind is hardwired. And we're now seeing what happens when that plays out at scale, when you are being, hit in the face with a fire hose of information that is information you want to hear.
My take on this, again, as a college dropout who went from the fine schools of New Jersey, I feel like our brains are not equipped for all this information.
No, they're not. Nope.
It's going to take 100 years to be. I mean, as we made it clear, we grew up in the 3-channel universe, and then cable, and then the internet, and then we had internet. The information was drip. We had drips and drabs. Now, using your term, we have fire hoses of information in our hand, in our pocket at all times, and I just don't think we're equipped to handle so much information. We're not ready for it.
No, you're 100% right. There's there's absolutely no evidence that we are, and all of the evidence that we're not. The human mind is not meant to be able to suss out the truth of every single piece of information that you're presented with on a daily basis. How would one do that? How do I know if the bridge in my hometown is structurally engineered in a safe manner? How would I know that? I'm not an engineer. You know what I mean? How do I ascertain that? It would take me years to become actually proficient at engineering bridges. Like people have to go to civil engineering school for that. But yet somehow I'm supposed to figure out if that's true or not. That's just like one tiny example. Our grandmothers, our great grandmothers, they before even TV news was a thing, they maybe read the newspaper. If their family was well off enough that they could afford to subscribe and they weren't so busy trying to subsist with their 18 children digging up potatoes in a field, and they're trying not to, die of hypothermia. Maybe they read a newspaper. And by the way, newspapers of the past used to be hyperpartisan. You would subscribe to the newspaper that had the belief you agreed with. The idea that like newspapers should be objective, that's a relatively new idea in U.S. history. So there's been no time in human history where the idea has been one human should be able to ascertain fact from fiction on every possible topic. That's an absurd idea. No, you cannot possibly do that. And so consequently, it's a very, very challenging. It's challenging to have the entirety of human knowledge at your fingertips or in your pockets at all times. It's both exciting and also maybe a little dangerous.
Yeah, and scary. And I'm not sure if you've gotten to read it. I have not. The new Yuval Noah Harari book about the internet. It's got, I think, the whole Nexus, and the
Nexus.
anecdote that
Mhm.
went viral. Yeah, it went viral about the fact that, we all talk about how fake news is spread now because of the speed of technology. But apparently, when the printing press was created, the number one selling book for decades was a book on how to identify and kill witches. So we have seen this story play out before. It was obviously a little slower with the printing press, where it probably
Yes.
took them like a month to make a
Had to
book.
be
But
carried on
now,
horseback. Mhm.
right, and then delivered to the town, and then maybe everyone shared the book. But why do you think, and again, I know it's not your expertise, but why do you think we're so gullible when we see something we read? That's that, and it sort of has to do with our conversation we've had. Like, when we see something, we immediately believe it. Whereas I think that, I think not the whole population. There's a cynical part of the population that will see something and like immediately not believe it. So what do you think it is? What does our brains do when we see something, and we either depending on how our brain is hardwired, like you mentioned, we immediately discount it or we immediately believe it?
Mm. Well, some of it, again, you're absolutely right, has to do with that hard wiring. Some of it also has to do with our set of moral beliefs that underpin our judgments about the world. And we are constantly subconsciously asking ourselves whether two questions. If you encounter information that seems to fit into your already existing worldview or your already existing moral framework, you are asking yourself if it fits with that, can I believe this? And you are looking for ways that will help you believe what you have encountered. Your brain is going to help you rationalize your belief in that thing. It is going to actively search that out. And if you encounter information that that goes against what you already believe, your subconscious brain is asking you, must I believe this? Because I don't want to. And so you will then actively begin to use your own biases to confirm what it is that you already believe. How many times have you Googled, because I have certainly done this, Googled a question that is phrased in such a way so that it supports your already held belief? Why is Blink 182 a stupid band? You know what I mean? Like, why? What is wrong with P. Diddy? You know what I mean? Like, we actively seek out information that is going to tell us what we want to hear. And in the absence of that, our brain will help us gather that information and confirm what we already believe. So your brain desperately wants to continue believing what it already believes. And one of the other things that reinforces this is that it actually feels good in your brain and sometimes in your body to
Right.
encounter information that you agree with. It feels good. You're like, yeah, that feels
Wow.
good. And it can feel bad. Like, and some people experience like a physical sensation to encounter information that is counter to what they already believe. Which is why, like, it does not matter how many facts somebody presents about candidate A, or like, here's all the reasons why candidate B is so dumb, you guys. You cannot vote for this person. They're terrible. Have you ever encountered anybody who's been like, wow, I've really had my mind changed by this person on the internet giving me all the facts about candidate B? No,
Yeah.
because
Nope.
your brain desperately wants to protect you from that,
Yeah.
because that's how we have survived evolutionarily.
I told a story. I was at a party. I'm originally from the New York City area, but moved down to Charleston, South Carolina a few years ago. And I was at a party, and it was, and I get along. You could probably tell my vibe. I'm pretty liberal, but I can get along with conservatives. And it just so happened that at this party I was at, a guy from Long Island who was also conservative we kind of got into this thing about Trump and everything like that. And so he goes to me, he goes, listen, the problem is the Republicans have facts, Democrats have opinions. So how could I debate with someone who thinks anything he says is true and what my opinion is basically just opinion? There's no facts to go with my opinion. And the reason I bring it up of where I am is like, I've never had discussions like that with good old Southern people. Like it's a typical. It was a dick from Long Island who says to me this like this thing at a party, and it kind of killed the mood of the party. I felt so bad. My wife hates when I talk about politics at parties, but the reason I do is because I want to hear why. Please tell me why you love this orange person. Please tell me what it is he will do that will improve things. Please tell me. Tell me what the folks on the blue side are doing wrong. I want to know. And I think that's a problem too. People get, siloed out. We've kind of touched upon that. But there is this idea that no matter what someone else says, it will never change my mind. And I feel like if we just, I don't want us to be 100% open up, because I know that's not going to happen overnight, but if we could slightly open it up to be like allowing people to have a voice and not just consider them as just opinions, I think that taking baby steps could really help in that direction.
I think you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that the more somebody's beliefs are attacked by the opposing side, the more tightly they will cling to them. And that's actually kind of infuriating when you think about it. If you're like, candidate A is guilty of the following 950 crimes, and candidate B is Mother Teresa. You know what I mean? Like if that's what you are like, and you're trying to convince them that like this person is actually Hitler, you cannot vote for them. The more you try to attack their beliefs, the more tightly they will cling to them. And it seems like that's so frustrating. Why won't you listen to any facts? That's a very frustrating process for humans. But you have to understand that the belief system, when it comes to politics, is akin, in many people's minds, it is as deeply held and valued as a religious faith. And now imagine if you are raised in New Jersey and you grew up Catholic. And
Bingo.
I come up to you, and when let's say you go to mass every weekend, or you go to Catholic school, it's important to your parents and grandparents and whatever. And I come to your house and I ring the doorbell and I talk to your mom about why the Pope is actually terrible. He's a satanic figure. Catholicism is a cult. Blah 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 blah. Right? I give her all my spiel about how terrible being Catholic is. Is your mom going to close the door when I leave and be like, wow, Sharon, that's really given me so much to think about. I'm going to really choose to reexamine my faith in this church. Like, oh my gosh, whoa. Yeah. Or am I going to immediately be the problem? Your mom is immediately going to be like, this crazy lady came to the door. She's obviously misguided. She's probably going right to hell, right? Like there's no sense that your mom would consider the words of a random stranger ringing the doorbell attacking her faith.
Yeah.
The only thing it would do is make her cling more tightly to her faith.
So when did religion become politics, though? That's a great example you bring up, Sharon. It's like we always kept those two separate. Like religion, you clung on to, and politics, you were malleable. But now religion is politics, and vice versa.
You really there's always been an aspect of this. Okay, they've never been fully separate, but the idea that religion and politics are deeply intertwined, and in many ways, your political beliefs are the same same importance to you as your religious beliefs, really begins in the 1920s, and then heats up into the 1950s, and now as we're propelled into the 2020s, you can see for some people, this is not everybody, but for some people, that is still absolutely true. You can see that this begins to grow, deep roots in the 1920s, during a time of incredible change in the United States, where we had millions of immigrants coming to the United States who were largely Catholic and Jewish. They were from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And the sort of makeup of the United States was changing. And there was a lot of reticence on the part of people who were already living here to accept these new waves of millions of immigrants. And during the 1920s is when you see the second coming of the KKK, which was a religious organization by and large. The KKK proliferated throughout the entire United States, 1/3 of the white men of the city of Denver were members of the KKK. They infiltrate every level of government, with the exception of the presidency. Governorships in Indiana, all kinds of legislatures, members of Congress, Supreme Court justices. The KKK became a very, very legitimate organization with tens of thousands of people marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. without wearing hoods, because it became a Christian organization. It was a white Christian nationalist organization in which they used their holy scriptures to justify their belief system. And this was also when you see the KKK move from being sort of this extrajudicial, extra legal organization of the Reconstructionist period in the United States to being one that was anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-Black, and 100% American. That was their phrase for waspy people. 100% American. And they infiltrated every level of civic life. The normal people were in the KKK. There were children's groups. There were women's groups. And so one of the biggest ways that they proliferated was through church services. Pastors would allow KKK members and recruiters to come and recruit from their pulpits on Sunday mornings. And so as much as we would like to divorce ourselves from that kind of past, the KKK rose again in the 1950s. And who was it that was largely upholding the laws of Jim Crow and segregation? It is white Christian churches. Not all. Nobody needs to write in and say she thinks every Christian was like this. I absolutely do not. But nevertheless, these two movements are absolutely linked. And your religious beliefs about how the world was supposed to work and your political beliefs, they became like the Venn diagram became almost a circle, as opposed to these two circles that have, for some people, have always existed separately from each other. But during the 20th century is when we really see those sort of circles of the Venn diagram move together and become just like two concentric circles.
Wow. And the historians listening to this may also know that those white Christians in the South that you talk about were Democrats, or Dixie Democrats, as they're called. And then the John F. Kennedy came along, sided with the Civil Rights Act, and all of a sudden, one day, all these Dixie Democrats became Republicans. So you saw this change in history with just one people say, oh, well, the president has no power. Think about it. Like, if Kennedy doesn't side with the Civil Rights Act, eventually someone will, but like, how much longer do you think that would have taken for someone to have the balls to do that? And then for a whole bottom part of the country to flip on one decision? It's pretty remarkable, the power of one person, what we could do. And that sort of leads into your book, and the small and the mighty, what you're writing about. And I want to be a full disclosure here. My parents were immigrants. My father fled from Spain, and then my mom was a Cuban refugee in the 60s. So I grew up in an immigrant household. Spanish was my first language. English is barely my first now, but as you can tell, but my lack of grammar. But I will say that I've always embraced the immigrant mentality of working your asses off, working for the man, all that. And I think for a while, we embraced immigrants because they kind of looked like us. You were talking about the 20s and everything, but then all of a sudden, they're just white people. They look all the same. It's they have an accent or something like that. And now you're seeing this pushback against immigrants. They don't look like the same as us, and they talk differently. What happened there? Because I felt like, as you write about and know about, this country was built on the back of immigrants. Why all of a sudden are we so afraid of them? And I get our immigration policies have been shit, and we didn't handle the border well. I will be the first to admit that. What happened here? Why all of a sudden we went from embracing the magic of immigrants to now being like, oh yeah, no, we do not want these people here anymore?
The United States has always had some element of xenophobia and nativism, and it goes in waves. The pendulum swings back and forth. You look at where we were in the 1890s, and then the pendulum swings over in the 1920s. And the pendulum sort of during the Reagan era began to swing, where Reagan was actually a big champion of immigrants, in the way that the unique way that Reagan was. But Reagan openly talked about how much we need to value immigrants. And so there was this sort of pendulum swing back. And I think right now we're in the middle of a hard pendulum swing back to the other side of sort of xenophobia and nativism. These concerns that the wrong people, and I'm using air quotes when I say wrong
Right.
people, are coming to the United States. That's not new. We have had concerns about the wrong people since the 1900s, where we have passed like Chinese exclusion acts, where we did not allow people from Asia to move here. We were concerned that Chinese workers were going to take all of the white people's jobs. We then created something called the Asiatic Barred Zone, where anybody from like a big circled area on the map that included like India, China, like basically almost all of Asia, unless you were here to be like a religious minister or you were some like super high level businessman, nobody was allowed to come to the United States for decades from the Asiatic Barred Zone. So the United States has always had these sort of elements of, these elements of anti-immigrant sentiment on a pendulum swing. And we're now, because a huge percentage of our immigrants, by the way, our anti-immigrant sentiment always corresponds with where the largest groups of immigrants are coming from.
Right.
So when we have anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish sentiment in the 1920s, it's because that's who was coming here. Now we have a very sort of anti-Latino immigrant sentiment that if you are from Central America or even the Caribbean, that you are invading. We use words that they used in the 1920s, an invasion of immigrants. So the idea that like the wrong people are coming to the United States, that's not a new idea. It just grows in correspondence to who is coming to the United States. It doesn't matter. Like it used to be people from Greece and Russia, and now it's people from from the Caribbean and Honduras, Nicaragua, etc. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Trump famously had that quote of what I think it was something like, why don't people from like Sweden and Norway come here? Why are they coming from shithole countries? And I'm like,
Yes.
Anyone in the right way would be like, well, why would anyone from Sweden want to come to what are we offering that they don't already have in these Scandinavian countries? So that's neither here nor there. So before we get to the book, I wanted to ask about how you got here, because I'm not sure if you're aware of this. You're a woman, Sharon.
Weird.
And in your world, it's mostly we talked about old white guys with gray temples like myself writing these books, being in this world. How did you find yourself here?
Through a lot of hard work, Joe. I've worked hard to get here. Weird. Nobody, no person came and like tapped me on the head with a magic wand and was like, "You're the one." I had to work for it. No, I've been a teacher for most of my adult life, and now I just teach people on the internet instead of in a high school classroom. But I've spent the last 4 years sort of cultivating a community online, as you have, of governors, of people who are interested in history, interested in how government works. Many of them are people who are sort of rediscovering their interest, or actually even discovering an interest to begin with as adults, where they realize, like, I never learned about any of this in high school. Maybe if high school was less about high school history or government was less about tanks and less about Thomas Jefferson, maybe there would be, a renewed interest in it. And I think that, again, you're going to see that pendulum start to swing back. But I got here because I started making little fact-based, nonpartisan explainer videos on the internet right before the 2020 election, when people were being really confidently wrong on the internet. And they were saying things like the Electoral College is a university you can graduate from. And just things that were not opinions, things that were just objectively false, wrong on the facts. Sorry, Chad, you're wrong on the facts. Go ahead and Google that. Google's free. There's no University of Electoral College. So I just started making these little videos about that I hoped would have more longevity than just me arguing with strangers in the comments. Right? Mm-hmm. So that's how it started. Yeah.
And what's wonderful about that is because now I think more than ever, we're hyper aware of how government works, because we're seeing how it's not supposed to work. When you see a president put people in the Supreme Court who are solely going to decide and make decisions based on their political ideology or religious ideology. And we're like, that's not why the Supreme Court was built. And then you're seeing how people don't understand how the legislative branch works when it comes to confirming elections, and that, someone should be able to step in and stop things. So it is, in a way, all of the shit that's gone down has kind of helped us to be like, oh yeah, by the way, we do have these checks and measures in place for a reason, and this is why.
I do think that there is sort of like an awareness that's been created in some groups, not all groups, as unfortunately has
Right.
not infiltrated all levels of
Right.
society yet. We're getting there. Of like, actually, that's interesting, huh? I did not know that these institutions that have been constructed over almost 250 years, or coming up on our 250th anniversary as a republic, um, that they're actually meant to withstand the hurricane. Like one of the infuriating things about US government is that it's very, very inflexible and slow to change. And there are
Bureaucracy.
things, yeah, yes, there are things that like everyone wishes they could change about US government. No person with any education is like, it all works great. Two thumbs up, like you mentioned our super broken immigration system. Anyone with any knowledge about immigration will tell you it is catastrophically broken and needs to be fixed. They might differ on how they want to fix it, but nobody would disagree with that statement, that it needs to be fixed, that you should not have to wait 10 years for an initial asylum hearing. That's bananas, okay? 10 years is a bananas amount of time to have to wait for asylum, which is legal for you to try to seek in the United States. We should be able to adjudicate these kinds of cases far more quickly. The fact that we don't means it's broken, right? So that's just one example of how much needs to change. But the flip side of being inflexible and slow to change is a level of stability, a level of strength that does not exist if something is extremely flexible. You want something that can bend with the wind, but you don't want something that's just going to get flopped over this first time gale force winds come by. So, you think about it more in the sense of a skyscraper that has to bend with the wind a little bit. And a lot of people want the skyscraper to bend faster, but the institutions that we have built have remained relatively stable over the last 250 years, for better or for worse. There are some things that have remained too stable and that should probably be destabilized. But nevertheless, that is one of our, the pros of the American system of democracy is its stability. So, yeah, there's a lot to change, and we can work on changing those things. But there's also a lot to value, and we have to be willing and able to have enough education to suss out what is worth keeping and what should we work to change. Because if we just get a blowtorch and light fire to the entire thing, who knows what it will be replaced with, right? Like a dictatorship that, violent, bloody revolutions have often not led to increasing amounts of freedom and democracy for the citizens.
Yeah, I had this conversation with a client of mine who's a doctor, was in the military. He like patched up brains of soldiers in Afghanistan, has guns. And one day I flippantly say, like, man, I wish we could just do something about these gun laws. And I always keep things simple. I'm like, I'm fine with the Second Amendment. Could we just make it harder for people to get guns? That was my thing. Just make it harder. And then he came back to me and said, well, there's levers in place to change that if they wanted to. And then he threw in my face, gingerly, he said, it's like the First Amendment. We all love the First Amendment, but when the First Amendment was written, it wasn't written to include a technology that could reach hundreds of millions of people on the click of a button. So there are checks and balances in place to do that. But the problem is, Sharon, is do the checks and balances in place want to do anything about it? That's what scares me about government in general, is the fact that now the tribalism has seeped in so much into it's almost party before country. And this could go
Totally.
for Democrats and Republicans.
Totally.
That all these changes that could be made, whether it's about the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, that could be, we cross the aisles and find a solution. But because of tribalism, all these checks and balances are almost thrown out. Like,
Yeah.
unless you're a Congress that has full power from one party, you're never going to get anything done because someone's going to stick into it because they don't want to agree with that party because they'll get primaried out in the next election cycle because they sided with the other party. That is this. I'm going to steal, in other words, that's the bananas part of this whole thing.
Yeah, you're not wrong. And it leads people to feel like really defeated and like nothing I do matters. And why should I even try? Like it leads to this sense of like cynical nihilism of like, F it. Nothing, like all these people are just going to keep doing what they want to do, what's good for them. And I will tell you, I mean, again, I don't disagree with you that the incentive structure, especially in Congress, the incentive structure is broken. Where you will, if you reach across the aisle to be like, how about we put together a border security bill, an infrastructure border security bill, which they just recently did, and then it gets killed because politics, right?
Yes, we know. We know.
Yes,
We know the
yes,
backstory.
because politics. Um, the incentive structure for people working together on behalf of the American people is broken. So the idea that like you're going to get penalized if you work on bipartisan bills for the betterment of America, you're penalized for that. That's an indication that it's broken because all you're doing right now is propping up, maintaining, and consolidating your own power. That's all you're doing. Your party rewards you when you get in line. Your party rewards you when you get in line. I will tell you, though, that there's a flip side of the coin here, which is that this incentive structure is not new. Like we can look to the past and be like, well, in the 60s, we passed the Civil Rights Act. In the 60s, we passed the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act. Like we did a bunch of cool stuff in the 60s. Listen, how long do you think it took to get to that point in the 1960s? That was not just like, oh my gosh, people were so much better then. Like how they were. People in the 1950s were out there actively beating Black children who were trying to attend a school. Okay? Like that's all they want is like, I would like to receive an education, please. No, we're going to, some children were killed in this process. So I want to encourage people to remember that, this sort of like, this famous Martin Luther King phrase about the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. What we have to remember is that arc is it's not a rainbow where over time the rainbow leads to a pot of gold. That arc exists because people reach up and bend it. Not because it is a foregone conclusion, but because people work for it. Because people reach up and pull it down so that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And the converse can be true. If we decide to just throw our hands up and be like, F it, y'all are effed up, I hate all of you, go away forever, light the whole thing on fire. If that is our mentality, that is not the fertile soil from which good things can grow. And if we look back at the civil rights movement, which by the way was just a bunch of relatively ill-equipped young people. Okay, Martin Luther King was shot dead when he was 39 years old. Look at what he managed to accomplish in his young lifetime. It was a bunch of ill-equipped young people, some of them pregnant teenagers that I write about in this book, who had absolutely, you would never pick them out of a lineup and be like, her, let's go with her. She's the one. No, she's like literally a pregnant 16-year-old. How is she the one? You know what I mean? So the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice because ordinary people bend it. Not because we wait for the people in the halls of power, not because the people in Congress got all their shit together, not because they were like, oh my gosh, we've been so wrong, we're returning from our evil ways. No, because normal people bend it. And I think we need to move away from this idea that we're going to be saved by people in government. Listen, I'm a government teacher. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not somebody who's like, again, I don't think, burn it down. I'm not saying burn it down. We have to simultaneously, though, work within the system to change it and also do stuff outside of the system to bend the arc of the moral universe. If all we ever do is like, but the system's broken and so broken and so broken and so broken, we're just going to go around in this endless loop and nothing is going to get done. The civil rights movement didn't happen only because they convinced LBJ to champion this in Congress, and LBJ had been the Senate Majority Leader. He was real good at making deals. That's not the only way it happened. It happened because we did this and we did all this stuff too.
I feel that one of the problems with our current structure is that the job of a politician, when they get elected, a congressperson, senator, what have you, it's too good a job. Like, we've made that job so good that I've worked in media my whole life, Sharon, and I used to have this running joke that a publicist or PR person's first job is not get fired. Like, regardless if you do your job well, job number one is don't get fired. And I feel like that is the mindset of most elected officials. Don't get fired. Keep this job. I like having a staff. I like having a place in D.C. I like having private cars and jets, and I have rich people taking me out for dinners, or if you're a Supreme Court justice, taking you to islands. I mean, I think it's too good a job. And I don't know how you fix that, whether it means like less money can go to these people, donations. I don't know how you fix it, but I think that's the thing. These jobs are just so goddamn good that they're like, man, I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep this job. If me having to agree with a psychopath, fill in the blank psychopath, then I'm going to do it because I really, really love this gig.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. It's not that being in Congress pays so much, pays less than $200,000 a year, and they have to have 2 houses. And yes, that's well above average. Of course, you can live a nice life on $174,000. Of course you can. But the way that one of the fundamental, like, I have a whole list of proposals of things I would like to change about the way elections work in the United States. And one of those has to do with getting dark money out of politics. When we return to making the job about public service, and we remove the unlimited amounts of billionaire dollars that have infiltrated politics, and that is a new idea, by the way. It's new since 2010. That is part of the incentive structure that is very broken. People used to, like the Kennedys, for example, of course, were well connected and they were well off. And there were, it's a whole separate episode to talk about everything that went on with the Kennedy family. But nevertheless, they were interested in being in government in part because of the public service aspect of it. Right. They probably, through their dad, could have got enough connections to get plugged into some very lucrative business. Robert F. Kennedy Sr. did not have to become the attorney general. He could have been a private attorney and made a lot more money and not have gotten assassinated. You know what I mean? So it wasn't that there were no other opportunities available to the Kennedy family. It's because they valued, in part, the public service aspect of it. Same is true of Lyndon Baines Johnson. He had a whole ranch. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like he didn't have it wasn't like he couldn't have worked in big oil. Same is true of the Bushes. It's not like they couldn't have just worked in oil and bought baseball teams.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's an element of public service that is of a higher value to some people than just the acquisition of money and clout and power and status. But since the Supreme Court decision in 2010 that allowed unlimited dark money to be funneled into campaigns, you've seen a pretty large, in my opinion, shift towards in a direction that I don't think is healthy for us to head. There's no other, the only other countries in the world that allow this amount of cash influx into their systems, we would look at them and been like, that's corrupt.
That's sketchy.
You know what I mean? That's sketchy as hell. What the hell are you doing? But somehow it's legal in the United States because of the First Amendment.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's try to wrap things up on a high note here. Talk about the small and mighty. 12 unsung Americans who changed the course of history. Why this book right now? I mean, we sort of answered the why in the last 50 minutes or so. Yeah. But what inspired you to write this one?
Yeah, I think we have gotten so hung up on this sort of fatalistic view that nothing good can change, that I don't have access to the levers of power. I don't have billions of dollars. I'm not an elected official. I don't have a weirdly shaped rocket ship to like blast myself off into space with. Like the idea that like an ordinary American can't make a difference, I think is one that idea has become very pervasive in our culture. When in reality, so much of the good that has been done in this country, like the civil rights movement that I just mentioned, has been done by just average people. Some of them were born enslaved. Some of them were born in the Jim Crow South. Some of them were the children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. These are people without access to the levers of power who changed the course of United States history. And I think not only are these important lessons just to know because we want to be educated about our own country, but these are stories that we need today because we need to know that actually what we do makes a difference, that actually who we are makes a difference, what we say makes a difference, who we vote for and how we spend our time. All of these things make a difference. And I really love knowing the secret history of the United States. That's always super interesting to me. How did that happen? Like that is always like a question mark above my head. How did that happen? So the sort of like the secret aspect of these stories that perhaps most people have never heard, I think is also just a fun one to read.
That's so cool. I lucked into writing my own book a couple of years ago, and as you probably know, this is like you kind of go in with an idea of like, yeah, I'm gonna write about this, this, and this, and that, and then all of a sudden something comes like, oh shit, I gotta put this in there.
Uh-huh.
Did you have like one of those oh shit moments where
Oh, yeah.
you originally didn't have it in the idea of writing the book, but then included it anyway?
Yeah, totally. There's a couple of stories in the book that are actually interrelated, and you don't know that they're interrelated until later on in the book when I sort of like bring up how they're interrelated. But yes, there are. I had initially intended to tell these sort of two separate stories, and then when I found this, through all my years of research, took me years to work on this, found this other story that connected these other two stories. I was like, dang it. That is so good. That's so exciting. Yes. And it is very challenging when you are writing like a research intensive book or you're writing these kinds of stories. It's challenging to know like when do I stop? Because I could just keep going. I could keep researching. I could keep finding new things to include, like cutting yourself off of like you have enough. That's part of like the process too, is knowing when to be done.
That's so cool. It almost sounds like you put together like a usual suspects thing where there's like a twist
Uh-huh.
ending of the connection. I love that. That's so cool. Very nice. All right. And lastly, you are America's government teacher, but you also look like Deborah Norville, the host of Inside Edition.
Do I?
How often do you get stopped and asked that if for an autograph because they think you're Deborah Norville, not because you're
No.
America's government teacher?
No, no, people don't remember Deborah Norville unless you are like from that specific Inside Edition generation. More often people think I look like Adele. Um,
Okay.
oh yeah, that's more often. Or Nicole Kidman is the other person that I sometimes get.
There
It's
can
the
be worse
cheekbones.
people to be compared
Yeah,
to. My
I'm not
lord.
mad about it. Yeah.
So tell me about these Adele run-ins. Where did it happen, and like how disappointed were these people once
Oh
they
my gosh.
realized and you start talking with your Minnesota accent?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, there's one funny story about Adele. I was being presented with an award in New York for like Communicator of the Year. And so I had to speak at this award, and I arrived to the venue early because we're doing sound check, right? We're doing like a rehearsal and a sound check. I am wearing my full evening glam, right? Like floor length dress, hair, professional hair and makeup. Two of the people on the service staff at this very high end venue in New York City come running up to me. And the woman is like, Miss, wait, wait. And she goes and she gets this other man who I found out later is her husband. And he comes running up to me and he wants me to like sign the papers that they have. And they're like, are you going to sing tonight? And I had no idea what they were talking about. I was like, why would these people want my autograph? This is an award for like Communicator of the Year. You know what I mean? And it dawned on me when I'm like, sing what? Because I'm not a singer. And they named a few of Adele's songs. I was like, oh no, no. I in that moment I was like, do I disappoint them and be like, I'm not Adele? And then they're gonna feel embarrassed? Or do I say like, actually, I'm just accepting the award. I'm not singing tonight. You know what I mean? So I ultimately let them down because I didn't want them to go tell everybody in the back that Adele was there that night when I'm not. But that's definitely like one moment of where people were like, "Oh my gosh, is Adele here?" No, it's not me.
Oh, that is an awesome story. The name of the book is The Small and the Mighty, 12 Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History. She is America's government teacher, Sharon McMahon. Sharon, thanks for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So good to chat. See you soon.
And that's today's Good Listen. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please tap that thumbs up button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, it'd be really sweet if you hit a 5-star review. I would really appreciate that too. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on X, LinkedIn, or Instagram at Joe Pardavila, or on TikTok at jpardavila. If you want to shoot me a note and tell me your story, email me, joepardavila@protonmail.com. I will see you next time. Thanks again. Adios.